Hello, and welcome to a video on stat boosters and how to use them effectively in Fire Emblem. And today we're going to be talking about stat boosters, how to design them, how to think about them, when to reward them, and pretty much everything stat boosters. I think it's one of those things that doesn't get talked about a lot, but using stat boosters well as rewards and as items to give away at different times or put in strategic locations can help make your game more interesting and, in my opinion, fun. I like stat boosters. I think that there's a lot you can do with them, both from a design standpoint as far as what stats do they boost, but also how do I give them to the player and think about when the player will receive them to avoid them breaking the game. So we're going to talk a lot about stat boosters and how you can better use them as a hack-ROM designer. And here we have Nino and Asbel, who are both very good recipients of stat boosters, obviously. So what are our learning objectives today? We're going to compare the pros and cons of stat boosters. Sometimes stat boosters are great. Sometimes you probably don't want to put a stat booster in a certain place. Let's talk about that. Determine when and how to best reward stat boosters in your game, and contextualize the timing of stat boosters to best enhance gameplay. So we'll talk a bit about how you can go about rewarding players and designing the stat boosters, and then think about, well, how do I know that I've given the right amount of stat boosters and that they're in good places? Well, let's talk about that. So stat boosters, Tomas is going to tell us what they are because he really wants them. These are the stat boosters in vanilla FE8. These should come as no surprise to you. They're all familiar. It's pretty much the same across all of the GBA games. Most of the modern games have similar equivalents, albeit with different names. But generally speaking, these are the bonuses that you can get in vanilla. It's pretty common now for people to make some type of second +2 magic booster if they're using the strength magic split, which is doable. Boots, I always call them boots, even though I know vanilla FE8 calls them swift souls, but you get what I'm talking about. These are pretty much all of your boosting options in vanilla. There's also I should have added the AFAS drops as well, which is the +5 to growths, which is another thing that you can adjust to. And also the Emblem seal from the Mario Kart Double Dash bonus disc in FE7, which would let you increase growths to the unit that holds them. So some other things to consider on the growth side, but we're talking purely just like boosting stats. These are your options, and so there's a lot you can do here, and we're going to talk about it. So when you're thinking about giving stat boosters out to the player, think about, what does the stat booster mean for your balance? Because the player is always going to use the stat booster differently than how you intend. Some players like to hold on to their stat boosters and never use them until the very end, where they load them up to help hit caps and make the last chapter really easy. Other players on the opposite end of the spectrum will pump every stat booster they get into their Jagan to get as much mileage out of them as possible. A lot really depends on how the player approaches the game. And as a designer, you need to try and account for as many of these different scenarios as possible to avoid making one strategy too centralizing or game breaking to the point where the player feels like, okay, if I don't do this with my stat boosters, then I have no chance at winning. That's the ultimate thing you want to avoid. And it starts with this first bullet here. You want stat boosters to enhance performance, not be required to meet a specific threshold. I shouldn't need to give a stat booster to my Jagan so that I can one-round the boss before the boss one-rounds me. If that's the case, then it's kind of a puzzle, and that's not really fun. You're not really rewarding a stat booster, you're making it a requirement to have a certain unit take it. Some units, of course, will benefit more from the stat booster than others, and you can certainly design with that in mind. Perhaps, you have a secret book in your second chapter, and your squad is a lord, his 2 woodcutters, the mage girl, and a priest. Probably one of the axe bros is going to want the secret book. You'll know that because it's so early. Um, so keep these things in mind. Don't make it required to meet a specific threshold or to hit a specific benchmark to attain a new tier of performance. It should just help the player make the game feel a little bit easier, make certain aspects a bit more reliable, help them kind of enhance the strategy they would probably want to do anyway. When it comes to designing your stat boosters, there's a couple different things you can do. You can do multiple tiers of boost. So I think it's pretty common for people to make secret books more heavy on skill or luck, or goddess icons more luck oriented by adding additional points to there. I've been experimenting with different tiers of boosting. So like you have weaker stat boosters that do like +1 to a stat, or a higher one that does like +3, that you can telegraph a bit more. This might make sense in like a longer game, or if you're not giving out a ton of stat boosters or have a really big cast. Something you can do there. You can also create hold items, which provide that static boost at expense of an inventory slot. I think this is becoming increasingly popular as well. I know Souls of the Forest does this with the stat boosters that you can hold, and that becomes the trade strat. FE7X does this pretty extensively with the ones that also boost growths. I know Sun God's Wrath has different scrolls, like in Thracia, that help with growths and stats as well. So there's a lot of things you can do here, and you'll want to think about how does this enhance the gameplay and who is this going to help be better. And the reality is that the player is irrational, and they might decide, you know what, I want to try and do this Mimi build where my mage girl has tons of strength, and so I'm going to give her like the strength growth thing and all this stuff. And at that point it's like, all right, well, not much I can do. Generally speaking, multiple tiers of boosting and hold items are just new rewards you can create, which allows you to make more different types of anti-turtles and not bore the player by just being like, oh great, another secret book, which I know I'm guilty of. Next, you want to consider the placement and where you can find them. So generally speaking, I think stat boosters are best rewarded as rewards for achieving some type of anti-turtle incentive, whether that's getting to a certain village on time, whether that is reaching a chest on time, whether that is accomplishing some type of side objective and getting it in the epilogue. You could also put them in secret shops like FE6, which I would only advise at the end of the game as an absolute fail-safe for the player to make sure they're not totally screwed over. I generally am of the mind that you want to make your game beatable towards the end, and if there are ways that you can add crutches to help players whose armies might be more battered get through the rest of the game, that's a good thing. Stat booster shops are a good idea towards the end. I wouldn't put them too early because an enterprising player will exploit that and it will make your game broken in half. So I would advise against that. And lastly, lowering the price to make selling them less appealing. I know some people will see secret books and goddess icons, and I think even when people make the boosts more, I think a lot of players look at it and it's like, this is still only going to translate to like an extra 5 points of hit or another couple points of avoid. I'd rather get like 2,000 gold. And my view is that if I wanted to give the player gold, I would give them gems, or I'd actually just give them gold. If I want them to use the stat booster, I'm going to give them a stat booster. So I made the prices lower to make selling them less appealing. This, kind of becomes the inverse in the secret shop later when they're really cheap to buy. So it goes both ways, but it's an avenue you can consider if you're concerned that, hey, I want to give a stat booster as a reward. I'm concerned some players will just want to sell it for gold, and that can break the economy of the game a little bit. Try lowering the price. I know people are going to not be happy with this suggestion, but I think that this is one way you can encourage the player to actually use the stat booster a bit more versus making it just an easy sell and giving the player more gold than maybe you intend. Of course, you can always design intentionally for them to potentially sell the stat booster instead, but I think on the flip side, if you're saying, okay, the only gold I'm going to give the player is in the form of a goddess icon, then that's not really great either. It's all about balance in these scenarios, but just keep that in mind because the default prices on stat boosters is really high. So keep that in mind. Now, when should I reward stat boosters? So timing is really key. You want to put them at points where it makes sense and where it will help the player continue to move forward, not where it'll help them steamroll. So give them at points where they won't break the game. Like, I'm not going to give a speed wing in chapter 1 because chances are the speed wing is going to put them into a threshold of doubling and make the game really easy. Or it will just kind of mess up the delicate balance that I've planned at that stage. Maybe I would put weaker stat boosters up front, like, okay, here's your talisman, or here's your goddess icon in the first chapter that you can give to someone to help with these like more minor things, but like I wouldn't give an energy ring or a speed wing or an angelic robe in the first few chapters, because that's gonna be your bread and butter. That's gonna be the most balanced thing in place in your hack if you're doing it right. So just something to keep in mind there. Don't put them in places where they'll break the game or upset your balance too much, because otherwise people are going to say, this feels unbalanced. I gave my guy an angelic robe and he won't die. Hack bad. And it's like, well, if I didn't give that, maybe hack wouldn't be bad. You can also reward better stat boosters based on difficulty to attain. So I like to maybe the strongest stat boosters will go in houses where the anti-turtle incentive is really tight, and so only the best players will get them. Something to consider as well. It kind of makes those rewards that much sweeter. It also will incentivize the player to go for it. I know from my experience in Vision Quest 1.5, people really like going for the speed wing, even though it can be tough, and they want to make sure that they get that, and so it makes that reward that much sweeter. People will say it's not really worth doing if it's not great. Like, I don't think people would be as excited about risking it all for secret book. So we're really railing on secret books in this video, but I think most players aren't really that keen on them. So keep that in mind. Reward better boosters based on the difficulty to attain them. Don't let the player feed the Jagan and steamroll. So timing, again, becomes really important. If you put too many early, I think some players might just want to feed their Jagans to make the Jagans super units. And if you do a lot of stat boosters early and there aren't that many other units that may make obvious use of them, a smart player is going to give them all to the Jagan and just extend the shelf life of that Jagan pretty immensely. Now, depending on the length of your hack, that might not be a big deal, or depending on the strength of your Jagan. But going back to Jagan design, a good Jagan is going to kind of be sunset at some point towards like the middle part of the game. And if you're allowing the player to just pump them up with stat boosters, it's one, going to make the part where they're dominant even more dominant, and it's going to extend them deeper into the game, which may be to the detriment of the overall experience. Some players might find that fun, and that's great, but if you're trying to make something balanced that's also fun, just keep that in mind. Generally speaking, you don't see too many stat boosters come early in the game. Usually they come kind of towards the middle, later parts of the game, and that's for a reason. I think it's to help give them to players whose armies are a bit more beat up, where they might need the extra strength. Perhaps you just like lost a bunch of dudes and now you got a stat booster, so now you can boost up someone like Ogier or something like that who needs a little bit of a boost to kind of jump right into your army. Keep those things in mind as well. Do you give stat boosters right after a tough chapter? Is it the middle of the game where they might want to try out something different, or are they going to just like, hey, if you put an energy ring in the first chapter, that's probably going straight to the Jagan. So keep these things in mind with timing and avoiding the Jagan steamroll. This is a lesson learned for me. And then lastly, keep track of how many boosters you give throughout the hack. It can be super easy to forget just how many boosters you're giving and how often. Keep track of this. I don't think there's a magic number to consider, but just use your best judgment. I mean, think about it. Like, if you give 3 energy rings, that's potentially +6 power on any one unit. That's a lot. Or if you have a speed wing, 3 speed wings early on, that's +6 speed that you have to account for. That's like another unit being able to totally double. So keep that in mind. I generally think that you probably shouldn't reward. I don't even have a good estimate of like what the right spacing is for it. It really depends on your game and what you're giving, but divvy up the rewards. Don't only use stat boosters. You probably don't need to give a stat booster every chapter. Use them delicately. They are really good and powerful rewards in most games. And that's it. that's stat boosters. So I hope you enjoyed this video on stat boosters. I think stat boosters are really fun, and there's a lot of potential that you can unlock with them. We really only scratched the surface in this video. I think my main focus was really on the timing for stat boosters and how you can think about designing them in new ways, like hold items or changing the balance of them. Overall, I think that it's something that players should consider and experiment with more, because I think there's a lot of potential to make some interesting stuff. And again, how you balance these and how you give them out in your game, it's going to be a matter of trial and error. It's going to be a matter of getting feedback and testing, but use your best judgment and we'll take it from there. Well, everyone, thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next time for something different. Until then, take care.